All right. Let me just set up my timer really quickly. All right. Hello, my name is CaoLinh Pham. I'm a rising third-year creative writing major, and my project is Popular Planets, Biologic Futures in the Science Fiction Pulse, which I conducted under the mentorship of Dr. Catherine Buse and in conjunction with Jessica. You've heard a bunch of Dr. Buse's project from Jessica already, so I won't go too much into detail about that, but I do want to rehash again the importance of the epistemological, or I suppose for more comfortable terms, this more scientifically rigorous planet, a planet that's treated not as just an exotic background, but a planet that merits more attention and more rigorous examination. And my project also deals with the science fiction pulps from the 20s to the 40s. What do we mean by dialogic futures? By that, I mean that the creation of the epistemological planet is a result not of a single individual, but as a product of a community of interactions or dialogue between readers, writers, and editors of a magazine. And I'll go through two kinds of examples that I've gone through in my research that I think really portray this very well. So here's just a really brief timeline of 4 magazines that I'll be talking about today. And I'm sure you saw a cover art for these actually at the end of Jessica's slide as well. But these are amazing stories, astounding stories, wonder stories, and planet stories. And you'll notice, yes, they all have stories at the end. But aside from that, you'll notice that planet stories come much later than the other 3 publications, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but that is very important. So first, let's examine this from a historical approach. Amazing Stories is the first science fiction magazine, published in 1926 by Hugo Gernsback, and it being the first, it also sets the foundation for the rest. Gernsback makes it his mission to educate the public using science fiction, and it features very many reprints from older authors like Jules Verne, Edgar Allan Poe, H.G. Wells, that sort of experience. In 1930, Astounding comes out, and Astounding's mission is much more commercial. They're out to make money. And so their approach is much more formulaic. They encourage their authors to write the same thing, more or less with some variation. But that is, they're very commercially minded. And that comes in 1930. In 1930, Gernsback also compiles some of his stories, some of his magazines, into a magazine called Wonder Stories. And the editor for Wonder Stories, David Lasser, takes a different approach. He tries to encourage more experimental fiction by working closely with his authors, encouraging them to write it, and also facilitating a lively letter column, which I'll get to a little bit again. But part of this push was an encouragement for more realistic space stories. So away with the space opera, away with the planetary romance, he wanted something more plausible. Not necessarily a real planet, but a planet that could be real. Astounding also runs into financial difficulties. So in 1933, it gets acquired by Street and Smith. And the editor for that, F. Owen Tremaine, introduces something called thought variants to make Astounding competitive. He didn't want to fall behind Wonder Stories in this push for more interesting stories, so he introduces these things called thought variants. And the idea behind the thought variant was that it would be different than the normal story, I guess the formulaic story that was part of the old Astounding. And these stories would feature both higher literary and higher scientific quality. Skip to 1939. By this time, all of the major science fiction magazines, Astounding included, have sort of adopted this higher literary scientific style. And that is sort of like the mainstay of magazines at this point. But the editors and publishers behind Planet Stories are thinking, we kind of like the old planetary romance stories. So we're gonna make a new magazine that publishes exclusively planetary romances. And it is in these planetary romances that the old planet as the exotic background is the feature, whereas in the newer magazines, the newer style, planets have a more scientifically rigorous examination. And so you have concurrently 2 different representations of the planet, and because they happen concurrently, it's much easier to compare them with each other and say one of these representations is much more scientifically rigorous than the other. If you skip now to the letter columns that I mentioned before, these letter columns are crucial to the success of the science fiction magazines, and sometimes buyers of these magazines will not even read the stories in them and will just read the letter columns. But this letter column is very indicative of a dialogue between reader, writer, and editor, because readers will send in their letters. Writers also can send in letters either as a response to a reader letter or just as a letter to the editor. And the most important part, perhaps, is that the editors selectively decide what letters to publish again in the magazine for other fans to read. And so that forms the triangle of dialogue here. And I'll read these two snippets I have here. One says, on the left, from Astounding in 1934, then, of course, no science fiction magazine is complete without a readers column. And the one on the right, from Planet Stories in 1939, it ought to contain a letter department where the readers can air their views. No science fiction magazine yet published has as yet been able to get along with that, this readers department. And you can see from the time difference that the importance of this reader column has not diminished over this period. In these letters, readers will indicate their opinions for where the magazine should go, what they liked, what they didn't like about the stories. And the important part is that when the editors publish these letters again in a magazine, that can give clues as to where they want the magazine to go, confirmation of what they want the magazine to do, etc. So I'm going to be examining this letter in particular, and I'll read a snippet from it as well. The old Astounding, frankly, stood in the main for plain, outright action-adventure stories, such as you may read in any ordinary magazine, but surrounded, to give them a tiny taste of newness, by mechanical gadgets, planets, world menaces, horrible villains from interstellar space. The joker is that most of its authors, though they could think up these things and make them terribly blood-curdling, couldn't begin to explain them plausibly or indeed intelligently at all. It was all done for the thrill, the kick, the climax, and the happy ending. Deny it, you other readers, if you can. So you can see from this letter the identification of the old Astounding as the formulaic approach, and specifically outright action-adventure stories such as you may read in any ordinary magazine. And so in this sense, you see the planet as just an exotic background, which makes it technically science fiction, but otherwise could be any other setting. And this letter later on contrasts it with the new Astounding, which has a better blend of literary and scientific quality. It treats the planet as not just an exotic background, but as something that merits attention in and of itself. And it also is indicative of the arrival of the thought variance and the quality of wonder stories as well. Yes. So, what can we conclude? We can conclude the epistemological planet is a product not of a single individual, but of a community. And although there are perhaps indicative works that could mean breakthroughs, these indicative works are not the result of a single individual that comes out of nowhere, but rather that it is a response to a community that wants its attention. And I cite from my memory John Campbell's Articles of the Solar System, which were serialized and astounding. I would highly recommend taking a look at this if possible. And also that dialogic evolution, this idea that certain themes or concepts can evolve out of a dialogue between different parties, is in particular a characteristic of the magazine format. And what this means is that magazines are published fairly frequently relative to, let's say, novels per se. And the accessibility of the letter column and feedback to the authors and writers is also important. And the serialization of their works and the fact that their texts are a lot shorter makes it a lot easier to incorporate feedback into these texts again to be published in the next issue. And that makes magazines a site for more rapid and more noticeable evolution of these concepts than otherwise. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah. I'd like to thank CCRF, CSI, Dr. Hughes, and everyone here for allowing me to stand here. Question time. Yeah.
So how much did these two letters together, how much did they impact the stories that you thought published?
I'm glad you asked that, because actually a lot of letters will address specific stories in particular, and some of them are actually like really toxic. Like they will just go off. And the editor in some notes these letters like, I'll make sure that these comments go to the author so that they can read this stuff. And you know, the letters won't only address particular issues, but they'll even address like the author's like work as a whole. Some letters will be like, for example, there was an author named Ray Cummings, and the general gist of it was that people in letters would say, wow, you've done better stuff before, stuff like that. And I think it definitely affects the writers, what they put in their work, and also what the editor will ask of them in the future as well. Yeah. Yeah. So what I looked at was letters published in the magazines, and editors' comments to those letters will also be contained in those magazines. There are, of course, countless other letters that are sent in that weren't published. Those might be in some desk somewhere. Those could be in an archive, hopefully. Those could be in some wastebasket and burnt in an incinerator. Who knows? But a lot of the comments for the letters that are published are actually in the magazine as well. And some letter writers will actually ask for a more direct response from the editor, and so they'll get that response privately. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that the design throughout time was kind of how to increase interest in more scientific Christmas, and then we sort of got the older ones. Do you have any thoughts on like why that happened, or how do you talk about
that? What I'm about to say is probably hypothetical, so I wouldn't take it too seriously. But I think my guess would be that because science fiction and science are so closely related, fans of science fiction, I think, prefer to see more science in the science fiction to differentiate it from other genres of fiction that they can find in other magazines. And that would justify having a specialized magazine for science fiction, because otherwise you could just go to a more general magazine that has the same stuff. And so it almost doesn't surprise me that science fiction fans wanted more science in their science fiction. But at the same time, there is also another audience that really read the tales just to have a sense of exoticness of a state literature. And that audience, I think, was much better catered to by the old planetary romance style, where the emphasis was not on rigorous or plausible science, but just on a sense of exoticism.